So we have to go first on this question. Do you want to go second, or do you want to go first?
But you can go first if you want. I don't mind.
I have absolutely
You do.
complete flexibility. I think it's the fact that we're at the front end where it's
Do you think I should put a slide of like the title of the book or something, or is that slide better?
I think if we
No, I wasn't, but I do have a slide.
I would
Like we could do that. Oh. Yeah, we can.
either have the book or
Because they are broadcasting it.
oh.
But we don't need the screen for that.
No, I would either put the screen up or put the slide on, but don't just have a blank screen. So I could ask them to put the screen up if you want.
That was on the
Yeah.
the first day of feet, so like
Oh.
everybody's.
He's not doing
Oh, so
No.
wishing you and things like that, right? Yeah.
But what is it behind the screen?
Are you celebrating later? Are you meeting people to celebrate? No.
It's fine, but you went it out.
But maybe other students who are celebrating, other grad students or others who celebrate. No?
I don't know. I just
Yeah.
kind of.
I would rather do.
So we'll be starting maybe in another minute or so. Please note that there are books. The bookstore is out there with the books if you want to get them now or later for signing. But they are out there. There's a desk. Okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. Before we even start, I wanted to give big thanks to Ellen for helping to organize this event. And it is a real pleasure for me to introduce our guest speaker today, Jason De León, who is professor of anthropology and Chicano studies and director of the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology at UCLA. But he's so much more than this title suggests. An archaeologist who wrote his dissertation on Olmec obsidian, a musician who moved from hardcore punk reggae onto Americana and now plays bass in the biggest little rock band in Laurel Canyon, the War Pigs. Check them out. I heard they will be touring and passing through Providence this summer. A photographer, film producer, LA Lakers fan, recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award, and a friend. In 2009, Jason founded the Undocumented Migration Project, and started a long-term study of clandestine migration between Latin America and the United States using ethnographic, visual, archaeological, and forensic methods. Today, UMP is a research arts education collective that both raises awareness about migration issues globally while also helping to reunite families with the loved ones who have gone missing crossing the US-Mexico border. His first book, The Land of Open Graves, Living and Dying on the Migrant Trail, which was published by University of California Press in 2015, offered an incisive, eloquent critique of the Border Patrol's security strategy known as prevention through deterrence, which turns 20 this year. This book won numerous awards, including the Margaret Mead Award from the Society for Applied Anthropology and Staley Book Prize from the School for Advanced Research. It has since become a new classic in anthropology, one of the most taught books in the last decade. Following the publication of the book, Jason co-curated a touring museum exhibit, State of Exception, which displayed backpacks and shoes and water bottles and other items left behind by border crossers in order to draw broader public attention to the human consequences of US immigration policy. In 2019, he started curating a participatory art project called Hostile Terrain 94, which involves filling out over 4,000 toe tags that represent migrants who died while crossing the Sonoran Desert in Arizona and hanging them on a map. This installation has already been shown in over 100 locations nationally and globally. Today, Jason is here to talk about his new book, Soldiers and Kings, Survival and Hope in the World of Human Smuggling, which was published just last month in March by Viking. It is an ethnography of the lives of Honduran men and some women who have become smugglers, making a living from guiding undocumented migrants through Mexico. Pulitzer Prize-winning sociologist and fellow ethnographer Matt Desmond calls Soldiers and Kings a work of extraordinary reportage and compassion. It will shock you, move you, and leave you changed. Having read the book twice now, I assure you that he is right. So this is what will happen next. We'll hear from Jason, who will read some excerpts from his book. Then my colleagues, Professors Yannis, Hamilakis, and Peter Andreas, and me will engage Jason in a conversation, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. There will be books and book signing and the reception at the end. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Jason de León.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here. It's also just really wonderful to be here on this panel with three people whose work has long inspired me in different ways and who I've really enjoyed being in conversation with, either in person or virtually or in print. And so it's just really nice to be here with my fellow panelists. What I'm going to do, I guess, is I'll read just a little bit from the book. I want to just give a couple of quick kind of things first. Just a quick little bit of background. So the book is a trade book. It's been published by Viking Press, and it focuses really on the lives of about six individuals that I met who were sort of intertwined with the world of clandestine migration and people who were directly involved in human smuggling. The project began in 2015, right during a moment where border enforcement was dramatically changing in Mexico, where we were in the kind of wake of the summer of 2014 when thousands of unaccompanied minors largely from Honduras were showing up at the US-Mexico border, raising awareness about the issues that were happening in that country for a brief moment, and then suddenly those folks disappeared. And President Obama came out at one point later that year and said, problem is solved, these kids are not coming back anymore, we've secured the border. We hadn't really done anything at the US-Mexico border. What had happened is that in end of 2014, summer of 2014 and into 2015, Mexico launched a program called Plan Frontera Sur, which was basically their version of the U.S. policy of prevention through deterrence, which is trying to prevent migrants from Central America and beyond from getting across the length of Mexico. This policy goes into place with an intense amount of financial support and political pressure from the United States to basically stop Central Americans before they get to the U.S. doorstep. What this does is it leads to a rise in deportations of Central Americans and other migrants, checkpoints, detention centers, as well as a steep rise in corruption amongst law enforcement agencies who were charged with supposedly protecting migrants, but then who become deeply involved in their exploitation. Simultaneously, drug cartels and transnational organizations like MS-13 become even more interested in taxing the movement of migrants across Mexico. MS-13 starts to control the migrant routes and who gets to move people from one place to another, and transnational and Mexican drug cartels at different key geographic points across the country then start charging head taxes for people coming through. And so it creates this, Plan Frontera Sur creates this new kind of difficult labyrinth that people need to get through, and one that becomes much more violent and more expensive, and really drives the need for more human smugglers. And so the project kind of begins as this whole thing is happening, and as stuff is ramping up and smuggling is starting to change and become a lot more violent than it had been previously. And the book, the question has often been posed to me is why smugglers? And I think on the most basic level, smugglers are a crucial part of this global billion-dollar industry of clandestine migration, and yet probably the most poorly understood element of it. And so I wanted to try to understand this aspect of the process that little attention had been paid to. And so the book really, it's about the world of smuggling. It's about the labor that smugglers carry out. It's about the services that they provide. But it's also, I hope, helping the reader to think about smuggling not as the problem to be solved, but as a symptom of border enforcement, as a symptom of capitalism, as a symptom of climate change, and also something deeply connected to issues of poverty, race, and class. And so that's all kind of interwoven into the book, which really revolves around 6 sort of main people who I write about and whose stories are, some of them are directly connected to one another, some of them are running kind of parallel, and the book sort of moves in and out between all of those folks, giving you kind of what's happening to them currently, as well as lots of information and background about how they ended up in the world of smuggling, as well as their attempts to get out of it. So all that being said, I thought I would just maybe give us 3 or 4 kind of short little moments from the book, and then open up a conversation. So I was pretty excited to publish this book with Viking, primarily because John Steinbeck had published all his books with Viking, and it was like being on the same label as John Steinbeck. And I asked the press when I was going to get to meet him, and they said hopefully not anytime soon. Steinbeck has always been an important writer for me, both I think thematically and just even stylistically. And so there's a chapter in the book where I introduce a little tiny village called Pacalna in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas. And the beginning of Cannery Row, it starts off, Cannery Row in Monterey in California is a poem, is a blah, 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 blah. And so I stole part of that line for this introduction to the village of Pacalna, which in some ways really the characters that I came to know there, and the way that the stories are sort of intertwined, in some ways actually felt like I was living in Cannery Row, except instead of being near the water, we were on the train tracks in the jungle. So here's that introduction. Pacalna in Chiapas, in Mexico, is a poem, a bloodletting, a roadside memorial, a wish. Laughter echoing from inside a dark place. Blinding heat. Clothes wet with jungle. Railroad ties shiny and smooth from a million frantic footsteps. It's the sun reflected off sharpened metal. A rooster screaming. a man screaming. Hope and hopelessness, desire and greed. Pacalna in Chiapas in Mexico is the center of migrant worlds that disappear only to remake themselves in new outlines and shadows. And Pacalna is this tiny little village. It's on the outskirts of the town called Palenque, which is known for the archaeological site of the same name in southern Mexico. Palenque is a big tourist attraction, tourist trap. Pacalna is quite the opposite, but literally the other side of the train tracks. And Pacalna is where I began a lot of this work. It's where I met this crew of smugglers and individuals who I ended up spending quite a bit of time with on the train tracks at the beginning of this route from southern Mexico up to the U.S.-Mexico border. And so here's a moment with a bunch of people who I will later then write more about in the book. Look, kid, you're Mexican, Papo says. You're from here, and we're not. When you're older, you'll have the privilege of leaving Pacalna and crossing up to the border without worrying about getting deported before you even get there. So, for now, fuck off. The boy, who is barely 6 or 7, stands firm. He doesn't want to leave. Get the fuck out of here, Papo yells. The kid is a statue, naked except for threadbare dress pants whose frayed cuffs barely reach his ankles. He's a miniature Robinson Crusoe shipwrecked on these train tracks. He is poor even by migrant standards. He is immovable. Papo's jaw tenses and his scrawny, tattooed arms flex in anger. He pushes the boy to the ground and I flinch. The boy's 4-year-old brother looks at Papo with great concern. We told you to get the fuck out of here, someone says. Just go, Santos implores them. The boy stands back up and is now crying, but he holds firm. His little brother tugs at his arm. These fucking children have no fear, Chino jokes. I try to intervene. Mira, papi, it's only because we're talking about adult stuff around here. It's better that kids aren't around. He gives me a blank look. Tears begin to fall. I awkwardly put my arm around his shoulder. He keeps crying. He starts to hyperventilate. Alma just shakes her head. Just give him 5 pesos so he will leave. She is cradling her own 4-year-old daughter, Dulce, and tries to shoo the boy away. Vaya, vaya. I put a thick Mexican coin into the kid's dirty hand. Papo takes a few aggressive steps toward the children. The boys turn and start heading south down the tracks. In unison, they step over scattered piles of garbage that decorate the ground, as if following some unspoken choreography. The older boy puts his arm around his little brother as they disappear into the distance. How many years will pass before they turn around and start heading in the other direction, like so many children before them? Jason, don't worry about it. Let him go, Alma tells me as she puts her bleached blonde hair into a tight ponytail. These kids in Pacalna are too much. They're always here. They're always stealing food from us. Every time we are drinking and smoking, that older kid is here. He even drinks caña, cane liquor. That's why I keep my daughter close and don't let her play with him. That fucking kid stole a bottle of tequila from us the other night, Papo yells. Oye, you better be nice to those children, Chino jokingly admonishes us, because in a few years, they'll be the new ones robbing us on the train tracks. We all laugh, knowing full well that it's true. And so all of those folks, Papo, Chino, Santos, Alma, are folks whose stories I end up following for many, many years as they try to come in and out of the world of smuggling and get off the train tracks. I'm going to read you, this is a scene here with me and Chino on the tracks where he's just kind of up to his normal antics. And yeah, we'll just do that. The lead engine lurches 50 feet forward, it stops, and then reverses, slamming hard into the car behind it. Grinding metal and screeching engine brakes compete with roosters and tropical birds. So we're still in Pakalna. The train heaves forward once again, reverses and slams backward. Keeps repeating this process, adding more rail cars each time. Chino is 15 feet above us, stoned out of his mind and giggling as he leaps from one moving car to another. He's a third world Peter Pan in knockoff Crocs, dancing for an audience of locals, migrants, and me. He's hamming it up and waving and grinning as he sprints across 3 moving cars in a matter of seconds. He runs and then he stops right at the edge of the lead car and then doubles back, mimicking the rhythm of this moving train. A couple of times I think his forward momentum will be too much and will send him flying when he tries to put on the brakes. It's a dangerous, stupid, and entertainingly juvenile game that allows him to show off for the crowd and remind people that he's crazy as hell and not to be fucked with. I remember myself at his age doing equally dangerous and irresponsible things to entertain my friends. Dangling from a 3rd-story roof, drunk and high on Vicodin. Putting a half stick of dynamite in my mouth and accidentally lighting the fuse while pretending it's a cigar. Pushing a 500-pound dumpster down a steep hill and then me running in front of it to try to recreate a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. In college, I never drunkenly ran across the top of a moving freight train. It's probably because I didn't have access to a train. On the surface, my shenanigans were mischievous at best and irresponsibly dangerous at worst. I thought of my behavior as simply the kind of jackass things that young people did for kicks. Shit to make people laugh, which they often did. Deep down, though, I was trying to fill a hollowness that lived inside of me. A darkness that manifested itself in bouts of crippling depression, intense feelings of isolation and rage, and a playful death wish that loomed over my teenage years and early 20s. People have asked me how I can spend so much time with smugglers whose lives are dominated by risk and creeping demise. It's partly because it feels strangely familiar. I don't know what it's like to rob or kill someone, but I know what it's like to want to live fast and die. For many years, it felt like hints of death were the only things that could make me feel alive. This is probably one of the reasons I get along so well with Chino. We are long-lost kin, bonded by childhood trauma and long histories of dangerous self-medicating and self-harm. I see something of my adolescent self in his youthful recklessness, in his embrace of a life where death is something to be taunted and almost welcomed. The death wish that I had to overcome and my own lifelong struggles with complex PTSD seemed to give me some privileged insight into Chino's worldview, as well as that of many other men involved in smuggling that I will come to know quite well. As I watch him foolishly play on top of a moving freight train, I think about a cynical line from Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. Addie, the matriarch of the Bundren family, says, "The reason for living was to get ready to stay dead a long time. But what if the reason for dying is to know that you were once alive?" It takes some coaxing, but Chino finally comes down from the top of this train. He and I shelter underneath a palapa and pretend that the heat is not smothering us. He grabs a stick and starts scratching out a map of train routes in the dirt. Names of towns are rattled off like a poem. Tapachula, Benemérito, Palenque, Corozal, Ixtepec, Tierra Blanca, Tenosique, Lecheria, Salto de Agua, Coatzacoalcos. This uneducated young man has an advanced degree in Mexican geography. He knows places to avoid, places where a church might open its doors, places where teenagers with machetes and no patience collect $100 head taxes. Survival here is a knowledge game with a steep learning curve. Chino speaks of a violent world of cycles with no viable end in sight. He says to me, "Man, I've spent a lot of time on the train, coming and going. Sometimes they grab you here and they send you back. So you try again and you go around that place. They grab you someplace else and you go around that place. And now you know not to go there either. You keep doing that and doing that. You come back and now you know where they caught you those times and you go around those places. It's simple," he says. "Immigration gets tougher and we invent new routes." "Well, how many times have you tried to cross Mexico?" I ask. maybe 5 times. I got as far as Laredo, Texas, he says. Well, did immigration catch you while you were crossing the border? No. I got across. It was incredible. I ended up living in a tree. I found some plywood and I climbed up into a tree with it. I had my little bed, and I tied it with some branches and ropes so that I wouldn't fall out. He says, I was up there in my little house with my cigarettes. I stayed up there at night. I spent like 8 days sleeping in a fucking tree, he says, laughing. Immigration would show up looking for me, but they couldn't see me. Chino was up there smoking his cigarettes, and Chino loves to talk about himself in the third person. He says, it was easy. They couldn't see Chino. And then they caught Chino coming out of a 7-Eleven. They were watching me as I left the store, and they stopped and asked where I was from. I told them I was headed home, but they knew I was undocumented because of how I talked. And Chino was always trying to convince me that he could pass for Mexican, and I would say it's a bit hard to believe that you're Mexican when your belt buckle has a Honduran flag on it, your wallet says Honduras, your arm has a big tattoo that says Catracho, which is slang for Honduran, and you've got a tattoo of a Honduran flag. And also you have the most intense Honduran accent that I've perhaps ever heard. But he said, no, Jason, soy Mexicano, he can do it. And it's like just this running joke. So I say, well, how long were you in the U.S. for, Chino? He says, like a month. But the problem is that you get there, and then what? Where are you going to go? You just end up on the streets. And this was the issue that so many of the smugglers that I work with come across, is they were failed migrants. They were trying to get to the United States, and once they got here, they didn't really have a social network to kind of support them, and so they struggled to just make ends meet, and for various reasons ended up getting deported or returned to Mexico. And so I said, well, when was the first time you came? He says, I came when I was 16, and I've been coming ever since. And why did you leave in the first place? I couldn't go to school or stay with my family because of economic problems. There were so many of us in the house, and only my mom worked. I told my mom, Mama, you brought me into this world, so thank you, but I don't want to be another headache for you because you have enough of those. So I left. I had a friend who said, let's go to Mexico, it's pretty good over there. But in reality, he says, it's really hard here. There's immigration looking for you, and being undocumented means you can't get a job. You go and look for work here, but people don't want to give you a job because you're Honduran. I said, when was the last time you were there in Honduras? He says, I left 7 months ago. I've been thinking about returning, but it's dangerous there because of the maras and all that stuff. He continues sketching out a map in the dirt. It shows the border with Guatemala to the south and Mexico City and Laredo to the north. His map covers thousands of square miles. Chino knows dozens of cities and towns and villages, but his view of them is tethered to the tracks. He never sees that all these places have to offer. It's like he's looking at the world through storefront windows. All right. Maybe I'll do one more. Is that okay? Okay. All right. Last one. Where did that go? I really should have decided this earlier. But it's like, it's kind of, okay, so this is a moment with a guy named Kingston, who, there were sort of two sort of types of smugglers who were, I guess, the things that were really categorizing the guys that I worked with were, one, there were the young guys, so folks in their late teens, early 20s, who were sort of in the game. They'd been for a few years, and we're trying to get out. And that's someone like Chino, someone like a guy named Santos, and then there were the kind of OGs, and by OGs, the veterans, the old men who were in their early 30s. And being a smuggler in your early 30s is, means you've been pretty lucky for various reasons. And those guys were also trying to get out, but were really kind of embedded and really were struggling to get away from this lifestyle that they had been a part of for so many years. And there were also sort of two groups of folks that I worked with. There were the mestizo Hondurans, the fair-skinned Hondurans, and then the Afro Hondurans, the Garifuna, folks who I worked with who were, those two groups really highlighted the issues about race, especially crossing Mexico, and the labor required to smuggle, someone who, if being black in Mexico was a very difficult thing, and requiring a particular type of smuggler, usually another Afro-Honduran smuggler. And so Kingston was a person who I'd spent a lot of time with, had a really kind of super difficult and tragic backstory, but an orphan at very young, in gangs very young, was in the Honduran military at like 11, was a sort of trained sharpshooter and all kinds of other stuff, but someone who was really struggling with violence and trying to get out of the increasingly violent world of human smuggling. And so here we're in a safe house in Veracruz, Mexico, hanging out on like a Saturday night. And he's talking about trying to get away. A dying electric fan pushes a mix of hot air and crack smoke around the tiny room. Kingston exhales and passes the pipe to Snoop. "Go smoke that shit in the bathroom," he says. "It's getting hard to breathe in here." Their buddy Chewy, who's sitting next to me, he squirts a rag with gasoline and places it over his nose and mouth. He takes 2 deep breaths and then tries to pass the rag to me. I politely decline. "No thanks, I had a big lunch." He cackles and he points at Snoop walking away with the crack pipe. He says, "That shit they smoke will kill you." We both laugh at the absurdity of his observation. In the background, Kendrick Lamar's voice tells us, "Bitch, don't kill my vibe." Things have gotten more dangerous on the streets of Veracruz, so we've locked ourselves in Snoop's apartment to avoid the chaos outside. A new cartel has entered the city and is leaving a trail of blood as they battle it out with locals for control of certain neighborhoods and drug corners. There's talk of gunmen sweeping through town, taking out low-level hustlers so they can install their own people. Kingston is worried they are after him. He may have to leave town soon. It's unclear if this is just generalized paranoia that accompanies smuggling and prolific crack consumption, or if he's actually in danger. Regardless, he has grown more insistent that he needs to escape. And I say, "Was it too late for you to get out?" "I don't think so, but then at the same time, I think that maybe it's too late. I did some bad things in the past, and like they say, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. I mean, I've been shot in the head, my foot, my neck. I've been attacked with machetes. But everything's okay, man. Life is life. I always say that there has to be good and bad things happening to you. If you don't have both, that shit is not real life. But what's it like to think that every day there might be someone that wants to kill you?" I ask. He says, "I worry about it a lot because I got my babies and my family." And then I say, "But you seem lucky. You made it into your 30s. He says, "I'm older than Jesus now." "I'm glad for that," he says, laughing. "I always thank God in the morning." I said, "Do you think that means you'll be okay?" "You never know. We could be drinking right now, and I go outside and someone comes up to me and goes, boom." He mimics shooting a gun. You'd be like, "Oh shit, that motherfucker was just here drinking with us." Life is like that. "But I'm tranquilo now," he says. "I'm just biding my time. But it's not easy, though, to be thinking that one day you could be dead." He says, "Some days I can't sleep and I ask myself, what the fuck is wrong? I don't eat, I don't sleep. I keep thinking about all the bad shit I've done. There are days where I be eating and I see things and remember things, and that shit kills my appetite." "So what's next for you?" I ask. He says, "Maybe I'll just kick back, start a little business. I want to try and live a calm life, a good life. I'm just trying to live through all this shit." I'm not saying that I'm going to be a Christian or a pastor or none of that. And both of us laugh at that idea. But maybe God can find something else for me to do with my life. He clearly wants out of this smuggling and gang life, but but his options are limited. He can't go back to Honduras because people want to kill him there. If he's caught crossing into the U.S., he'll face serious jail time. He doesn't have a Mexican work visa, so the only employment available to him is low-wage undocumented labor. He dreams of starting his own business, but clearly lacks the social skills to go legit. As night falls outside and we talk about his plans to somehow get out, we get antsy from being locked in the house all day. You want to go to the club, he asks. The last time he and I went to a club, we came out and he almost beat a man to death. And I say to him, that sounds like a really bad idea. Sure, let's do it. What could possibly go wrong this time? He says, cool. I just have to stop at my house and feed my dog. We go to his house to feed his dog, and we get there, and someone has stolen every single thing out of his house, emptied his house of 3 rooms of furniture, money, guns, everything. He's screaming in the front yard. They even took my gun, he yells. And suddenly I feel quite unsafe, wondering who would have the audacity to steal from Kingston, who was a very scary individual. We decide that it's not a good idea to stick around, and we say, let's get out of here. So we hop in a cab and head to the center of town. And I'll never forget this. We headed to the center of town in Veracruz. He's just had his house robbed. He's freaking out and screaming at everybody, and we stop at a stoplight. And I look over, and there's all these people selling like jewelry and stuff. And someone goes, hey, Jason, how's it going? And I was like, and it was these 2 archaeologists that I had worked with 15 years previously on my dissertation, who I hadn't seen in a long time. And they had some like side business. And I'm just in the car with this guy who is screaming about all of his stolen shit and his stolen money and his stolen gun. And I'm like, things are going okay. This kid comes up and tries to wash the window, and Kingston starts yelling at him and says, there's nothing here, Carnal, nothing. Get the fuck out of here. Chinga su madre. People that I'm with are like, what the hell is going on with you? And so we slowly pull away, and I kind of wave goodbye and say, I guess we'll see you later. And Kingston turns to me, and for the first time since I've known him, this scary individual who's always trying to project this hyper-masculine confidence is on the verge of tears. Look at me, he says, I have no clothes. I'm in a fucking tank top and chanclas. The taxi drops us off in front of a rundown club. The thumping bass from the inside gives the impression that the sidewalk has a pulse. Let's get a beer and figure this shit out, I tell him. We get to the door, and the bouncer gives Kingston the once over. Sorry, you can't come in here in sandals, he says. You have to have shoes on to get in here. And man, I swear, like my face probably just went white thinking about what could possibly happen. And I brace for the worst. But Kingston just nods and says, no problem. As we turn and walk into the night, I'm thankful that our evening is coming to an early end. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah, should be. Okay. So, Jason, I'm so glad you're here. As I was saying to Ieva a few days ago or earlier, I've tried and others to actually organize things for you here, and it was so difficult for you, partly because of pandemic, but because of you're in such a high demand, and rightly so, because of the incredible work you've been doing. So I've enjoyed so much reading the book, as much as I enjoyed the Land of Open Graves, and I'm looking forward to trying it out with students in the fall, as I have taught the Land for Open Graves since 2016. So there are so many things I would like to discuss with you, but as Ieva instructed us, we can only have a couple of questions and then open it up to others. And there are going to be mostly thoughts and questions at the same time. So I was thinking that this book is very different compared to the previous one, compared to the Land of Open Graves. And it's not just because it's a trade book compared to your academic book, it's also different in tone. And one thread that I actually saw coming through, and I'm glad you read that a passage today that actually speaks to it, and that's a reflective tone that you have, that you put yourself in a much more direct way compared to what you did with the Land of Open Graves. And I found that incredibly interesting, important for that kind of work. So you have talked about your early life and how it relates to what you do at the moment and the attraction you feel for topics like that. But towards the end, in the epilogue of the book, you also talk about or express a sense of ambivalence about doing this kind of work, writing this kind of book. There was a passage when you were talking about a sense of guilt. There's a passage where you say, what am I doing here? Is it that we're actually doing an autopsy on Genus's life in the lights of a university auditorium? So this is something that I think is incredibly generative for all of us who are involved in that kind of work. So I wanted to start by asking you to elaborate a little bit on that, especially that sense of ambivalence in doing an academic, scholarly project that becomes also a trade book, a public book, on the lives of those people.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that question. I mean, it's one that I've really struggled with.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we were talking at lunch about the talks that I've been giving about the book. Is it how do I sort of feel about it? And I think I was as I was saying to Peter, like I'm on the fence. Like I think with Land of Open Graves, I was excited that I had, or relieved that I had finished a book, partly because I just didn't want to lose my job, right? And so it was like, okay, I did what they asked me to do, but more importantly, I felt like I did a thing that felt like I needed to do for the families that I had been working with.
Yeah.
And with this book, it really ends up being, it was for, my friend Roberto. I'm right. I wanted his story to kind of be told, and that was this thing that was kind of driving me. But by the time I got to the end, there's no like triumphant moment.
Yeah.
There's no moment where I feel really good about it. I was dreading, like, this is like for me, this is a big wound.
Yeah.
And then I was kind of talking to my wife about it and saying, in many ways, I wish people could just read the book and get whatever they want from it, and I wouldn't have to go talk about it ever again. And it's like, because it's hard to talk about it in these different kinds of ways, but obviously, it's not just a testimony to this friendship or a promise fulfilled that I would tell someone's story. It's an academic book. It's a book that I got paid to do. It's a book that gets marketed. It's all those kinds of things, and that makes me like really uncomfortable. And and you kind of get to the point of like, okay, am I uncomfortable enough to not do it? Is it worth it to like put this out into the world because I think I hope it's going to do other stuff, and then there's these other things I just have to kind of be with.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of why it ends like that, where I don't feel good. I feel changed in a lot of. I mean, I will say that the thing I do feel good about, which was the surprising thing, was that having to write this book taught me a lot about empathy. In a way that I was not expecting. And I think that these folks shared things with me that changed me in so many ways, forced me to take stock of who I am as a person, as a researcher, and I'm grateful. It was like this gift they gave me that they didn't quite know that they were giving me. But then the weirdness of like, well, now I'm on a book tour, and it's like, what does it mean to be on a book tour about a story that, my friend dies in it, and then here I am, the person who gets to kind of talk about it. I mean, I don't know. So, but I think all anthropology, right? I mean, we're representing other people's stories.
Yeah.
And not enough people, I think, for me, maybe express that discomfort. I think a lot of us have it, and we don't say it. And I'm just like, I got to the point with many things in my life where I'm like, I need to just say it out loud, and that'll make me feel better because I don't want to keep it bottled up anymore.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I will have the chance to elaborate, I guess, with your participation, but I want to get to the second question, and that's more to do with kind of some of the more kind of, central arguments in the discussion around migration. And I'm going to bring in a little bit my own experience in working in the Mediterranean, and several of the phenomena you're describing here and in the previous book are, of course, very familiar to us in the Med. In some ways, the nation states and the EU actually copy policies that they were pioneered here, both all the policy you mentioned, and also the externalization of the border. So prominent in the South Mediterranean, in different countries, in Turkey, in Spain, and elsewhere. And of course, the phenomenon of the economy of the border you also discuss. And it appears to me that we are seeing here two versions of the border economy. The sanctioned version, where there's so much money going to various NGOs and to institutions, and the unsanctioned or illicit or kind of form of the border economy that smugglers represent. And we can even talk about competition between the two. So I guess one way of looking at the persecution that's so-called smugglers face here and in the Med is an expression of that competition. You are going after your competitors in some way because you benefit from that border economy in ways that you don't want them to. But I want to focus on another related facet, and that's the ideological function of the notion of the smuggler. And I know you're also ambivalent about using the term, right? I mean, many scholars talk about reclaiming it from a discourse that attributes to the smuggler all that kind of, everything that's wrong with the situation is smuggler's fault. But smuggler as a figure and as a phenomenon as defined by the state and super-state organizations allows the states to portray themselves as saviors, right? We save you from smugglers. The bad guys in the story of migration are not the border maker, are not the states, are not the EU, are the smugglers. And we'll come and catch them and we'll save you from that. And the story is usual, and we have seen so many cases where border crossers are persecuted as smugglers, because they happen to drive the boat or they happen to have the answer with the fuel money, and they in exchange of kind of the crossing, they drive the boat. So I would like you to ask and say a little bit about that kind of process that's happening, both the economic and the ideological function of the phenomenon of smuggling vis-a-vis states, in this case, the states, but in Europe also supra-state organizations like the EU.
It's such an important question, and I think in general, this is this term that we never interrogate, right? And it's like we hear the word smuggler, and it just has its connotations, and we don't really discuss the complexity of it, right? Exactly. And the border enforcement regimes, these industrial complexes, they need the smuggler to keep going, right? And in a lot of ways, I think that's part of why they this is the whole border game of like you need a bad guy, right? To justify bloated budgets, you need to be able to say, these are the bad folks. We need more money to kind of fight them. Let's not deal with the things that are driving them. Let's not deal with. Let's not think about them as service providers or any of these other things. Let's think about them in this very monolithic, and I think inappropriate sort of way. And so that helped. And then for smugglers, the border enforcement regimes, these industrial complexes, that just adds more. That just keeps them in business. When this work was happening in the beginning of the Trump era, like Kingston was like, I love Trump. Trump is great because he keeps telling all this crazy stuff that none of it's true. It's not going to change what's happening on the ground. But and I can double my prices because people are worried about these things. And so, and I ended up having interesting conversations with Border Patrol, who always wanted to know what smugglers were like, and smugglers who wanted to know what Border Patrol were like. But these, they need each other. And I think that, if we could decenter smuggling from the state, or not making that as the point of reference, then that forces us to think about this term in all kinds of new ways. And what happens if you think about a smuggler in this context as a service provider, right? As someone who is laboring as part of this capitalistic system that's providing a service and that's responding to the market, then suddenly it's not, it's like, oh, it's about economics, but in a different kind of way.
Or facilitator is the other
Yeah,
term that
yeah,
people have
yeah. I
used.
mean, there's
Yeah.
like, and I do think that pushing, the idea, changing the nomenclature, or at least giving us more ways to think about what it is to be a smuggler. I hope then it's not just to I'm not trying to valorize what they do, although I think a lot of migrants would, but I think it's to say, oh, let's demystify that.
Yeah.
And then, because this book is, it's, it's got smuggling in the title. That's like, salacious and tell me all the kind of terrible stuff. But I'm like,
Was it you or the publisher who insisted on using smuggling in the title?
They wanted, because they wanted smuggling in the title way more than me. I was kind of on the fence, and but we had interesting conversations of smuggling in the title gets people in the door.
Yeah.
There was a conversation about should we put Honduras in the title. I was like, that'll make people not read it because Americans don't care about Honduras. They don't even know where it is.
Yeah.
And so it's this kind of game. But I'm like, smuggling is in the title, but it's about capitalism, climate change, race, all this other stuff. But I think we can use the smuggler as a way, if we can flip the script a little bit, use it as a way to talk about these bigger issues and to move beyond the good guy kind of bad guy thing.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. Good over to you.
Nice. All right. Really fabulous presentation. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm eager to get my signed copy, and then I will ask you more questions later by email. But I'm going to violate the rules in one way by asking a lot more questions than one or two, but I'm going to make them really short and to the point, and I will just read them off, and you can choose which ones to jump on or not. So one is just, why write a popular trade book, right? How was the process different than your previous book? Was it harder? Was there this transition? I mean, a lot of academics aspire to do this, but few actually pull it off. And so I'm curious about that transition. What's most surprised you about the research? What did you not expect at the start? And you kind of hinted, your answer was empathy, what you said here. So is that the answer, or is there more than that? Where does the title come from? Who are the soldiers and the kings? I have a suspicion who the soldiers are, but I don't see the kings, right? So it'd be great if you could tell us that. We just discussed smuggling in the subtitle, but the title is Soldiers and Kings, so there's a mystery there. The other thing is these people have expertise in smuggling, moving, transporting human cargo, in this case, clandestinely, but their expertise is moving stuff. So why do they end up in one domain rather than another? The other one, obviously, is the drug trade. And how much do these things overlap? Because there's a conventional wisdom with they're intertwined, but actually my understanding is that they're actually quite separate, and the drug trade mostly just taxes them for using terrain to move through, right? And that's what makes it so dangerous. So why one or the other? And then last but not least, and this is a methods question for anthropologists, but in general, academic, how do you access smuggling? How do you gain the trust of smugglers? I mean, this part of the reason this is an underdeveloped area of scholarly research is precisely because of the difficulty, sometimes danger, not just risk, but danger of actually trying to do it. So how does one actually pull it off? And how does one even, IRB, your university system for approving you doing this kind of research, what insights can you give us about actually, I mean, this is ethnography on steroids in a sense, right? So if you could say more about that.
Thank you. I'm going to go in reverse then. We'll start with that last question. Accessing smuggling was incredibly easy and was not something that I was trying to do. I was in Mexico. I'd finished the first book. I was getting ready to transition to something else, and I was kind of done with migration. And I did a last field school in Chiapas. I brought a bunch of students down, and I said, okay, students are here. They need to be in a safe place. I took them to a migrant shelter where they get locked in, and there's these nuns that just kind of control all of your movement, and it's like a no-fun zone kind of place. And so I leave my students there. They're with my grad students. They're doing interviews with folks, and they're helping out in various ways. And I was like, I've been in migrant shelters for like 7, 8 years now. I don't want to do it anymore. And the nuns kept going, whatever you do, don't go outside. There's a lot of riffraff on the train tracks. And I was like, well, I'm so bored in here. I'm going to go outside and see what this is all about. And I went out there, was walking around the train tracks, and it was this simple. I see a bunch of like shirtless, like rough looking kids. There's a big cloud of marijuana smoke, all this like reggaeton playing. And I just kind of stumble over and go, hello, I'm an anthropologist. And what's going on over here, guys? And they were like, what? Who? And I tried to explain what I do. And, you know, like, are you a cop? I said, no, I'm not a cop. You know, and they're like, you're like a journalist. And I was like, kinda, but I'm maybe more annoying. I'm going to be here longer. And not, you know, and I said, I just wrote a book on migrants. And then someone just said, you know, why don't you listen to our stories? No one ever listens to what we have to say. And I was like, all I got is time. And they were like, have a seat. And it really was like that. Like within an hour, I'm recording interviews. And by the next day, it was more. By the end of the month, it was just like, okay, here's our chronicler. He's just here. And that opened up a lot of doors. And just, you know, going back and wanting to be with these folks who nobody ever wanted to be around, they just found that to be so novel. Like, you're just I'm like a weirdo, you know, and a lot of these guys, they'd never had a sympathetic ear. And so they just looked at me as like their chronicler, as their therapist, for good or for bad. And so I was just there, and I was utterly shocked. I was like, this is supposed to be a lot harder. It got harder later in different ways, but my presence there just seemed to just open up a lot of doors. And the guys who were doing it, you know, they were experts in a lot of these things. And being very violent, and selling drugs, not so much moving them, but definitely, you know, there was drug stuff on the side. There was extortion happening. There was kidnapping. There were some of the folks who were, you know, their other job was being a assassin, and so they were kind of doing that stuff. And then they saw smuggling as a way where they could use their kind of skills, but perhaps for some kind of good. And then so I had lots of conversations with folks who would say, you know, this kind of balances out the other bad stuff that I'm doing there. And so there was all these kind of moral, moments and ethical moments where they were, you know, where smuggling for them was like perhaps a route, some kind of way for redemption. And the title, so, you know, soldiers, there's all these foot soldiers, Chino, Santos, and the upper, like, Kingston would refer to the men underneath him as his soldiers, you know, my soldados. And so it's part of it was, you know, these low-level folks who were doing all the kind of grunt work. The king's part comes from a lot of these Honduran guys, you know, they'll refer to each other as king, like mi rey. And so there was this kind of term of endearment, you know, that you are my king kind of thing. But also there was this constant need for, especially for a guy like Kingston, to present themselves as the most powerful, macho, dominant male in the room, the alpha male, the king of this like empire, and yet incredibly fragile. Like, it was all, you know, smoke and mirrors, that within a flash everything could completely fall apart. And so I wanted to like you know, in this case, like, you know, who is the king in this whole moment, right? And how precarious is that position. The thing that surprised me, you know, the empathy thing was a big one. Another thing that surprised me was just the amount of boredom. I mean, you got to really like. I mean, it's a good thing that I like hanging out, drinking beer, and doing nothing, because that was like what we'd spent so much time doing, especially in this era of Plan Frontera Sur starting to happen. A trip that used to take 3 weeks was now taking could take 3 months. And so I'd be with these guys for 5 days in Pakalna, waiting for the train to come. And so we're just like sitting around. I remember I was telling Ieva that when we were working on this documentary film, Border South, the filmmaker came down, and the first day we go out there, he's got his camera, and we're sitting on the train tracks. And by like hour 7 or 8, you know, we've just been listening to music all day, drinking beer, watching these guys, you know, snort and do whatever other things we're doing on the tracks. He goes, so when are you gonna start working? I go, I am working. This is work, you know? Like, it's like you got to be in the moment, and a lot of times the moment is surprisingly boring, which is, I think, also why these guys like me being around, because that's free entertainment. Like, I got nothing. You know, they have to be there, and so they had someone who could you know, entertain them in various ways. But yeah, the amount of boredom, and then when you start to do the calculations, you're making under minimum wage for this whole thing because you're spending so much time, and it's like these bursts of money that make up for 3 weeks of not eating anything, but then it goes so quick. And so this idea of, these soldiers were making like nothing compared to, the higher ups who were actually, brokering the deals. And then the last thing about the trade book, why a trade book, I think first was, I just felt like these were stories that I wanted to tell for a larger audience, and I didn't want to bury the lead by trying to over theorize about it. That I just thought that and in the beginning there was this notion that it was going to be this photo ethnography where a big chunk of it was me theorizing about photographic practice and camera technology, and my agent was like, no, and then my editor was like, hell, definitely no. A general audience does not want to hear your take on shutter speed and ISO in relationship to these things.
This is what you told me in 2016.
Yeah. And so I was like,
ethnography.
and then so that's the companion book to this, where it'll allow me to kind of do some of those things that I want to do. But the story ended up for me being so compelling that I wanted to just not put other things in there that were going to be distracting. It was a different writing process in that I was kind of liberated. I felt like with the first book, there was so much pressure to do a bunch of different things, to make people happy, to think about tenure review, and when I got to UCLA, they didn't care what I wrote next, or if I didn't, because I made the jump. As part of my deal was I went from associate to full without writing a second book, and that was super liberating. When I go, oh wait, I don't have to write a second academic book if I don't want to. I can do whatever I want. So let's try this. And which was, like I said, liberating, but also really terrifying to sit down and be like, do I have any business trying to write a trade book? But I loved the process. I felt like I really got into it and enjoyed being with it every day, and feeling like my commitment with the trade book was really trying to be kind to my reader and trying to tell the most compelling story I possibly could, without having to worry about, does it have to be something else as well? It was just this thing, and I like that. But yeah, really a lot of pressure and a terrifying, working with a trade press, it's just a different beast, and you feel like, am I supposed to really be here? Is this this is not. It was uncharted territory for me.
You made lots of compromises in that process.
I don't feel like I made any compromises, and I think that my editor really understood the project in a lot of ways. That's why I sort of went with her, because I felt like I trusted her immediately, and so she just like, do what you want to do. And I was the one who was coming back and saying can I do this? And she'd be like, you can do this, it's okay, But she had a pretty light touch. But made, I think, very smart. When she needed to be present, she was really there and super helpful.
So for the sake of time and to open the floor for audience questions, I do have 2 questions, but I will only ask you one, either the policy or the ethnography one. I'll go with the ethnography one. So you write towards the end of the book, you say ethnography comes with a price. It comes with a hangover that lasts forever. And as a fellow ethnographer, I think I understand what you mean by that. I understand this disorienting and painful, like a whiplash kind of experience when you move from the field to academic space, and then the people you were working with, they kind of remain stuck there. And this whiplash is stronger when you form really strong relationships with people. And forming strong relationships with people means you build trust. So, and to build trust, you're taking risks, but also the people you're working with take risks to kind of talk to you. So I was wondering, could you say a little more about how you navigated these relationships with people and how maybe you set an ethnographic limit behind which you wouldn't go or your both maybe personal and ethical boundaries that you set out to do this research?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, ethnography is, it's personal. It can't be, I've had people ask me things like, is it okay to be friends with people that you work with? Or some people don't like those terms. And I was like, I don't know any other way to be, and I mean, it's a job, it's my work, but it's so much more than that, right? And you're connected to it in ways that, this is why my kind of ambivalence of this is a scholarly pursuit, this is an intellectual exercise, but it's also a deeply personal intellectual, it's got all these kind of things in it. And so it's hard to to disentangle those things. I think it's impossible to disentangle. And I think it is for most people, except the difference being a lot of times as academics, we're encouraged not to talk about those things. The questions that you've just asked me, what are your limits, what's too much, blah, blah, the whiplash, all these things. We're not supposed to talk about those things. We're supposed to hide those things. And I'm just not, I was telling your class today, I'm an oversharer, and it's I got to get it out. I have to let these things out because to keep them in, it's just, it doesn't feel good. But the work, it's, for me, I think the part of ethnography, why it's so challenging, but also so rewarding for me, is that these folks give you so much, right? They tell you about their lives and then trust you to go and do something, that you've promised you're going to do with it. But at the same time, I think they often expect that you give a lot of yourself to them too. And you're giving so much to the work and you're giving so much to people that it's really taxing. And it's a thing that it doesn't ever turn off. And especially now with social media and smartphones, people are texting all the time, you're in the field all the time. It's really hard to kind of decide then when is work over? When is it done? And for some of the stuff, it's a lifelong commitment. The folks I read about in my first book, I'm in touch with them all the time. And the person that I call Memo, who's in my first book, I'm his health insurance for the rest of his life. And that was a commitment that I never said, if you do this thing for me, I will always, take care of you. But when he became sick and there was no one else, I knew that was where I had to be. And that was just part of this, this process of getting close to someone. But but at the same time, I get so much out of those personal kind of experiences. But it is really, it's hard to know when to walk away. As we were talking about, there's some folks that, in your new book, which comes out next week, you should all get Ieva's new book. It comes out on Tuesday. It's very exciting. But there's people that you write about, people that I write about, that they're difficult relationships. And it's painful sometimes too when you have to cut someone off, walk away, figure out, that this is no longer a healthy kind of thing. And this book tested me in a lot of ways, about my own limits. And I tried to, I'm a character in this book. I play myself in this book, and part of that is because I wanted the reader to know who I was and how my relationships sort of had unfolded with these folks. But also, more importantly, I wanted you to know what the struggles were, because I think it's important for people to understand what ethnography actually is and why our struggles as ethnographers are often different than a journalist, right, who doesn't necessarily have a 10-year commitment to a topic or to a group of people, where we do, and that just comes with way different kinds of issues to deal with and work through. But yeah, it's an ongoing process that I wish it would not be ongoing, but that's part of the job.
Well, I'm so glad you're here and we can talk about these things in academic spaces. So we do have about 20 minutes for questions, and also we might have more time for your questions, Yannis, since you have more of them. But let's see what people want to ask. I think you need to use the microphones, because this is also going online somewhere.
A little short for me. Hi, Jason. Thank you so much. It is always very refreshing to listen to you. I will have a lot of questions, but I'll ask just this one. I didn't get the chance to read your book yet, but I read like some parts of Sharam Khosravi's like Seeing Like a Smuggler that came out like a couple years ago. So when you actually mentioned that, you know, the morals, ethics, like, or like the smuggling work as redemption, it kind of resonated with me in the sense that Sharam Khosravi was talking about, you know, smuggling as a kind of almost like anti-imperial or like, you know, political work versus, you know, people who are just doing it for the money. So that tension between like ethics, politics, and yeah, finances, money. I guess if you can talk a little bit about that, I'd be very happy. And the second question is, what happened to the dog?
Oh, yeah. Tyson. That's the dog's name. He got Tyson back. It took a lot, but yeah, the dog was returned, thankfully. I don't know if Kingston is the best dog owner, but he at least got his dog back. You know, the political work of smuggling, I do think that when you frame it as like a form of resistance or as labor or as you know, this kind of life-saving, you know, tether that people are reaching for, it really changes the way that we conceptualize it in all kinds of ways. And I was talking to someone recently, and you know, and they wanted to make the comparison with like the Underground Railroad, and saying, you know, a lot of people don't like that comparison. He's like, but there are people who were on the Underground Railroad who collected fees as part of that process, right? Like, I need some monetary support. I'm doing the Lord's work, but it'd be much better if the Lord had some cash for me to kind of do this thing too. And so I think that, but to do that with smuggling, people get really uncomfortable with it. The guys that I worked with, when they needed to really justify it, then it was this like, I'm providing a really good service. You know, just because, you know, I'm hyper violent, but me being hyper violent in this context and being well armed is part of me providing the services that you require. And so I got to do what I got to do if you need to get you, like I promised to get you where you're gonna go. A lot of times those guys would lean on that. Sometimes they believed it, I think. Other times it was an easier way to like avoid talking about money or about how much they were robbing people on the side and all this other kind of stuff. And there's a moment in the book with this guy Flaco, who I really got along well with, and who's not like he doesn't seem, I seem to be the only one who really likes Flaco. I mean, he's sort of like, people are like, they're kind of ambivalent about him. But there's a moment in the book where he's helping these people get across Mexico and up to the U.S.-Mexico border. And then one of his buddies who wants to get across, who's also a smuggler, he says, you know, Flaco's going to get me to California. It's going to be great. And Flaco looks at him and he says, don't put all your trust in me. You should put your trust into God. I'm only a man. Like, you know, I'm going to help you, but, you know, I'm like, you got to keep that in mind, kind of thing. And in the same conversation, I had been asking him, I said, but isn't it sometimes you have to like rob people, right? He goes, oh, I would never rob any. That's what bad people do. You know, like if you rob someone, God's not going to protect you, kind of thing. And we had this long conversation about religion and about how he's one of the good ones. And then I started asking about this kid, Jorge. I'm like, where did Jorge go? You know, and he had been smuggling for like 6 weeks. He goes, oh, I already got him across the border. He's great. He's already got a job. Things are wonderful, you know, and then story ends. And then 2 days later, Jorge calls me and goes, have you seen Flaco? He stole $6,000 from me and left me abandoned on the streets of Mexico, right? And so it was always interesting when those things kind of came up. And then there are other folks in the book who would talk about providing smuggling as a service, and I do think truly that was their goal. And there's a guy that I call Santos. I call him Santos because he's, for me, the most saintly one in the whole story, and he's the one that I'm like rooting for the most. And he, if he had said that to me, I would believe him 100%. But everybody's kind of justifying the work in different kinds of ways, and depending on when you ask them, you know, that would kind of color how they were thinking about the work in that moment. But in general, I think we should be thinking about this in these more kind of complex ways and getting us beyond this more simplified kind of narrative.
But
Okay. Is this fine if I just talk to you? You were talking, you were saying that they kind of saw you at first as like their chronicler, and later we're talking about your ongoing relationship and like your dedication to them. So I was wondering if you've had a chance to share any of like, in any form, the kind of like the results, if you will, of the ethnography and how that process has been, if it at all happened.
Selling books.
Yeah, I had once where I was giving a AAA presentation and we FaceTime with Flacco. And I was like in front of this room of like 200 people, and I was like, "Hey, check it out!" And he just thinks it's this crazy thing of like, why would people care about what I have to say? But then he got to the point where he's like, "So I'm going to be on the cover of this book, right? My face, all this kind of stuff." And I was like, "No," they all know about it like in different ways. Some of them are waiting for the Spanish version. I think they will be interested in reading it. Someone like Flacco, he's like. He's not a big reader, but he would be someone great to have on a panel. But it's what I ended up sharing with those guys the most, and the thing that they always were the most interested in was the photography. Was they always wanted to see the photos, and so I was constantly coming back and bringing images, and that was kind of true. And they're not. I mean, the pictures in this book. There's not very many of them, and most of them don't have faces on them by design. I think with the companion book, maybe you'll see some faces, but they're totally disconnected from any text, so you don't really. But I worry about facial recognition technology and all that kind of stuff. And some of the guys in the book, I was like, look, you need to make your Facebook profile private. Yeah. Well, why? I'm like, well, because you're holding a machine gun, a pile of money, and then it says under occupation smuggler. So we had long conversations about what these guys should and shouldn't be doing, but they weren't so much interested in the text. Although someone like Kingston was like, I want you to get this whole story, right? There's a lot of stuff. I want you to put all this stuff in there, and so he was very concerned about the whole backstory. But definitely way more interested in the photography. And even with the first book, a lot of those guys I wrote about are not, really literate. But like someone like my friend Memo, for him, anytime someone comes to his house, he pulls that book out and is like, look, this is me. This is about me. He's never read it, but he knows that he's in it. He can see himself, and that has always been this really important thing for him, which is difficult for us as anthropologists because, right, the IRB does not want us taking pictures, does not want us showing faces to protect people's, identity for various reasons, but it's really to protect, these corporations that we all work for, that are being cautious. But, these folks are like, they want to be seen. And with a lot of these guys in these books, they know that they're not going to see 40. And so they don't really care about, anonymity. I mean, they want some record that they were there and that they were important for a moment, which really creates a lot of tension between the requirements of the institution that we work for and our ethical commitments to the folks that we also are working for in some ways.
So thank you so much. I haven't read the book yet, but I very much want to after hearing your presentation. So my question follows up on some of these themes. I guess I'll link two parts. One is about the empathy and the effort in the book to kind of humanize and complicate smuggling and maybe not rehabilitate it, but at least make us think about it differently. But I was wondering, like hearing you speak and and thinking about the tone of the book that I'm gleaning from the things that you read, like were there people who when you kind of assess them, even with an empathetic kind of point of view, in the end you think this is a bad actor, this is a bad character, right? They're violent, maybe they've raped, they've stolen, they've killed. I mean, how did you navigate the reality that a truly candid depiction of human reality includes that bad side too? And did you feel any pressure in writing a book that's meant to kind of get us to think more complexly about smuggling? Did you feel any pressure not to include the worst of the worst? And that relates to the second part of the question, which is the audience for the book. So, I mean, I think as anthropologists, we often seem to write to the converted, right? We preach to the converted. So, do you have any hope that this book will be read by people who are most opposed to your politics on migration, or is it more likely to be read by people who sympathize with what you do, what you believe?
I hope that people will read it. I mean, at the end of the day, all we could do is put something out there and people can do whatever they want with it. And I think part of it, this question about audiences, that I hope that some people will just pick it up because they want to hear a good story about a thing. And that thing just happens to be smuggling. And maybe they'll come out of it thinking about it in a different kind of way, but it's more, is it a story about smuggling, or is it a story about 6 people whose lives are caught up in these things, one of them being smuggling, and let's get to know them kind of along the way. That's, for me, is probably a more realistic goal, is just like, these people were so important to me. My friend Roberto, who is killed during the course of field work, this is, for me, was a way to keep him alive, was the writing process. And like, the book ends with him like running around and acting like a maniac and telling funny jokes, but even though he's dead, I felt like I got to bring him back for one more moment, and he gets to kind of stay alive forever. I want people that, maybe that's the most I can hope for, is that people will get to know these folks and maybe think a little bit differently when they hear the term smuggler. That's it. Anything beyond that, is great, but I'm hoping that they can at least take that from it. In terms of the bad stuff, it's funny, the review that was in the New York Times 2 weeks ago picked up on this line in the beginning where I say there were some smugglers that I avoided because they gave off a bad vibe. And then the reviewer says something like, well, what about those folks what about the really bad people that you didn't hang out with? And I'm like, okay, well, I hung out with a lot of murderers in this book who were there were other people who weren't talking about murder, or who were just too scary. But there are definitely folks in this book who, there's this person that I call Payaso. Payaso was one of the scariest, most dead-eyed, cold-blooded killer who I just spent a lot of time with. And he's in there, and he's a knitter. And so there's a whole thing in the book about how I get freaked out by guys who knit now, because the other guy who's knitting, who I'm spending time with, ends up murdering, my friend. And so there is a lot. So that's there. And I try to keep that as upfront and let people know that it's lurking under the surface. Or sometimes it's just out in the open. And so it was funny. I wanted to write back to this book reviewer and be like, I don't know how much worse you don't think Payaso is a bad guy? He's scary, but also, he's the same person who's texting me from prison and being like, hey, I made you this SpongeBob SquarePants handbag, and these photos of this thing. And I'm like, I'm feeling weird. There's a guy that I call Preacher, also just cold-blooded killer. He's talking about murder. And so those guys are kind of there. I didn't spend a lot of time with them, for various reasons, but I spent, enough time, I think, where they show up. But I wanted people, so I wanted them to people know that they're there, that they're in the room oftentimes, but they weren't necessarily the ones who were the most committed to smuggling. I mean, they were there because they were there as enforcers, but someone like Kingston was there more, he would rely on these guys to do some of the dirty work, but he was someone who was more committed to the labor itself. And so I try to give people, know that it's a diverse group of people who are involved in this, and some of them, they run the spectrum of, what you sort of good to bad, if you want to frame it that way. But I definitely tried to keep as much of that in there as possible. And it scared the hell out of me,
So we have time for one more question. I know there was a hand there and a hand there. Okay.
I was also going to ask about empathy, so if there's another topic. I think mine's also in line with empathy.
Oh. Well, maybe you can both formulate your questions and then Jason will answer them together.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for sharing your work today. And I guess my question is a comment and then followed by a question. But at some point in your presentation today, and in the conversations that we had recently too, it was that question of who's the audience and what purpose does the book serve? I know that you mentioned that guilt of benefiting your career further based on this book, that is depicting so much violence and trauma for people. But I do think that there is a really important thing that's happening with the book, and I think Dan Smith mentioned it too about the humanity. My family is also from El Salvador, and I look at like what happens with incarceration rates in El Salvador right now in Bukele's government, where everyone is just, you present a certain way, you have a tattoo, you're looking a certain way, immediately go to jail, and hopefully you'll be seeing a court date at some point in your life. But what happens within the Salvadorian community is like this notion that, oh, they're all bad. And then there isn't much exploration as to what happened. How did a 14-year-old boy suddenly get caught up in all this? So I think that within like the Latino community at large, but then specifically communities that are directly impacted by this and that are then led to just believe this very black and white narrative of bad people and good people, I think it's important because I feel like you're illustrating a lot of really important things about the humanity of the people, but also, the masculinity that has to be performed, and machismo in Latin America, and then the PTSD that's caught up in that masculinity. So people performing it, being hurt by it, and then the cycle just constantly repeating. And then I don't know if in the book, I haven't read the book yet, but how it also impacts women alongside and other, trans folks and other people. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to know, I wanted to just say, I do think it's an important thing to do to show the complexity of the situation. In terms of my question, I guess I wanted to ask, knowing how maybe social connections work, if you mentioned that the nuns kind of warned you, don't go there, don't talk to these people, but then once you decided to pursue this project, did you find that people were still more vocally discouraging you to not pursue it? And then did you ever find that there was a moment where people didn't want to get close to you because they knew that you were close to people that they viewed as just bad? And then granted, I know that you're established and you can do this project and you have your own reputation, but I just wonder if you faced a bit of alienation because you were working closely and seeing people who other people don't want to see or who don't care to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to add your question too?
Sure. I'll just, you've said a few things about empathy already that I really appreciate, so I'll just add one thread to what you brought up just now, which is I bring this up also because I'm very invested in the responsibility of writing about this. I'm interested in the shift from what you experienced to then how you go out and write it for a broader public. And I wondered if you could say more about that, since you talked about empathy first as a very personal experience, if that feels like when you're writing it for a broader public, that is a kind of translation of the empathy you felt, or if it's a different exercise, thinking about the kinds of stories that are needed right now. And I say it because I worry about the failures of empathy. So I work in the Mediterranean and think about things like the huge and then very short-lived response to something like the circulation of the photo of Alan Kurdi on the beach. So
We're
just
talking
wondering
about,
how you negotiate that kind of thing.
We were talking.
Storytelling.
Yeah, we were talking about that photo this afternoon, and just it's short shelf life, and then so let me see here. We did this documentary in 2019 called Border South, that the movie ends with me in a migrant shelter talking to all of these Central American migrants about how dangerous the U.S.-Mexico border is and how all these people die crossing the desert. I didn't want to give that talk to this group of people who were in southern Chiapas, and they were eventually going to get up there. But one of my grad students said to me, the nuns are so sketched out by you because you're just outside all the time with these bad people that they're wondering what you're doing. They're wondering why you're in charge. All this, so can you come in and do something to kind of show them that you're not just some extortionist, scumbag, whatever. And so that's why there's that scene in that film where I'm giving this talk that I never would have given had I not been pressured to like show that like, oh, actually I'm okay, I guess, you know, I've got good intentions. You know, there were a lot of moments where people were like, what's up with your friends? You know, like what, like, you know, how do you hang out with these guys all the time? And, you know, me trying to explain, you know, what I was doing. And, you know, I think, and part of the book and one of the things I have to come to grips with too is like, what does it say about me that I get along so well with these folks, right? And so I try to write about, you know, my own position and why that is. And you know, it was this, you know, this idea of like, is it like the pornography of violence? I'm trying to fill the like suffering slot, right? Like those are like questions and critiques that have been put forth. And for me, it ended up being like, I have a particular understanding, I think, of violence and it's familiar in various ways. And that's and what's happening with these guys. There's this gravitational pull that we're sort of we see each other in a way that maybe others won't, which is not something that I would ever want to like. You know, wanted to put on a T-shirt or like, hey, I'm fucked up, and so that's why I study fucked up stuff. And then now this is the book where it starts out where like, hey, I'm fucked up, and this is, you know, but that was an understanding that I came to as I was like asking myself, why am I here? You know, how am I being judged? And I need to explain myself. But yeah, that would kind of come in and out in different moments, and so I just had to put everything on the table, both for myself and I think for readers. You know, and in terms of the empathy stuff, yeah, I mean, you always worry that you do this thing and it flashes and then it goes away and then, you know, and now we move on. Like Black Lives Mattered for 3 weeks, and then, you know. Central American kids that were really important for like a month, and now it's gone away, and that's a struggle. And I think for me, the storytelling, I hope, you know, about these folks that can last longer than, you know, it's not a story about migration or a story about smuggler. For me, it's a story about these individuals who happen to be doing those things. But if I can really focus on those stories, I hope that it'll impact people in a way that it impacted me and stick with them longer. And so that when you hear the word smuggler, if you read the book, then you go, oh, is that Kingston? Is that Chino? Is that Alma, or whoever it is? That maybe for me is part of the goal. It's not so much to like, I'm not trying to begin with like, let's empathize with smugglers, or, you know, it's more like, let me give you these stories and see if that works. See if you can that'll stick with you. And my favorite ethnographies are the ones where I remember the people's names, right? That's like I go, oh, that person. That's who I have in my brain, and that's what I kind of hope. And you know, I spent a lot of time in this book on the backstories and really building into that so that people kind of understand what's happening. I mean, there's this moment where Kingston almost kills this man in front of this bar. The backstory that I try to tell about that is this happens in a moment where he's trying to protect me, and this reaction, this hyper violent reaction, is not just because he is this like violent person, but in some ways it was this act of protection and care for me. And there had been a moment in his childhood where someone that he cared about had been attacked, was been murdered, and the question had been put to him, what are you going to do about it? And he didn't do anything in that moment, and forever regretted that, and had then created this like hyper violent response that was really his way of like showing care. And that's like, for me, it was just this difficult thing to kind of write about and to grapple with. But I wanted to try to give the reader this backstory so that now when they think about that story again, they're like, oh, like this person who grows up in this hyper violent world, like this is their version of empathy. This is their version of care, right? And which I think we often don't get. Okay. We don't get that, right?
Do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, no, just a tiny comment on this, just to finish. In relation to this discussion about empathy, which is one of the key threads, Jason, I think you end up with an epilogue that is more about politics and less about empathy. And for me, that was a very, very strong message, because you talk clearly about the beneficiaries. So you're saying to all your readers, hey, you people are your benefit from this, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's perhaps another way of relating to empathy, but at the same time not forgetting that it's also about who benefits from this kind of border regime.
You know, I mean, everyone in this room, we benefit from the labor of smugglers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we just, I mean, we don't think about that, but that's, that's how it works. Whether that's the drugs people are snorting in the bathroom, or, the labor that's been moved here, people who've been brought here to now and provide, crucial labor for various economies. I mean, this is all in the backs of smugglers. And that's an awkward conversation, it's like, but I mean, it's obviously true.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, and thank you to the panelists and the audience. So there are books outside. Jason can sign them. There's also a reception. We can continue this conversation in more informal manner. Thank you.
Thank you.